is him talking about infinity. And
But anyway,
I used to talk a lot more about infinity, and we probably should start talking about it again because it's just so misunderstood. It's not beyond you at all.
the straightforward mathematical worry is that you just can't calculate anything, even in principle, because it's infinity divided by infinity. That's the argument that people like Paul Steinhardt put forward, saying that the current version of eternal inflation should not be taken seriously as a scientific hypothesis. Now, that's a tricky one, because there you have to say, well, maybe. The thing about infinity divided by infinity is sometimes it's just completely ill-defined. If you just say those words, you can't actually pinpoint what the answer is. But in practice, for specific examples of infinity minus infinity, maybe there is a perfectly unique, well-defined procedure for turning that into a well-defined number, right?
When I first started this, if you go back and you watch my second video that I ever put out on this channel, where I introduced my work, it was before it was even called Sentient SIngularity Theory. I just wanted to contribute to this conversation. I had no need to push my own theory. And but I open it with like a discussion about infinity and one, and I'm not gonna say that I wouldn't change some ways in which I said things back then, because that was the first time I had spoken publicly about this project. My ability to define things at this point is much more developed than it was then, because I had not spoken to anybody about this stuff ever before this, and that was the first time. So while my models are basically the same as they were in that, my language is very different than it was. But I talk about infinity there. And first of all, what is infinity? Infinity is, if it is anything real, it is starting from one and then going up in quantity endlessly forever. That's what infinity means. It's one and above, growing, not as a static thing, as a dynamic structure. It's not a static number that is static. That's why we get so confused by infinity. As we sit there, we're like, well, can we even conceptualize infinity? And then we try and think about it. We try and think about it as a static quantity that is endless, which is impossible. But if you think about it as a dynamic growth process of starting from one and going up, that makes perfect sense. In a fundamental sense, that is infinity. You can't go backwards fundamentally. You can only start, and you can't start at zero fundamentally. You only start at one. Fundamental metamathematics starts at one, goes up. That's it. There is no negative numbers in metamathematics. Or metaphysics. There is no zero in metamathematics or metaphysics. But infinity, if you think about it, what is infinity divided by infinity? It's the same as anything divided by itself. One. That's it. Anything divided by itself is one. And infinity divided by infinity is one. That's the answer. It's it's super simple math. It's not even simple. It's so simple that it's beyond the normal rules of mathematics to some degree. And there's a point in this, what he was stating, he was talking about, and it might have been a mistake, he said infinity minus infinity once. He said infinity divided by infinity multiple times, but then at some point it seemed like a slip up. He said infinity minus infinity. I don't know if that was intentional. That is a much harder question to answer. I still think the answer is actually one, but that means that that's very odd, because that is a different rule set. That's really different than, like, you would think that would mean zero, because if you follow the rest of the rules of math. But I think that the actual answer of infinity minus infinity is one. It's not zero. It can't be zero. And because of what the nature of infinity is. And but we don't have the context of infinity because we don't assume sentience. And when you don't assume sentience, then you don't assume starting from a single sentient being that is dividing itself. And when you do that, then you realize that you have to start with 1. You cannot start with 0. But if you don't assume sentience, then you try and start with 0, and that's what throws you off. And so, but infinity is starting from 1, going up endlessly. That's it. And this is when I say, like, you can't go infinitely backwards. Infinity minus infinity, you get to 1. And because that's as far back as you can go. And like fundamentally, when we're talking about fundamental quantized existence, we're not talking about relativistic, effective mathematics that's a tool in any situation that you want to try and apply it. I'm talking about like a mathematical fundamental description of reality as infinity. It starts with 1, goes up. And it's just interesting that infinity divided by infinity is obviously 1. It's obviously 1 because it can't not be 1. But infinity minus infinity is the hard one, and because it does require a rule change. It's not because you need to be so smart to think about it, but it's because you need the context in order to think about it, because you realize that the rules don't work. And the traditional rules don't work of mathematics in that circumstance. So, but I'm almost positive that and I don't know what use this is, but I'm just saying it's interesting. And it was Sean Carroll's probable screw up to say minus instead of divided that caused me to think about this. But I think that infinity minus infinity, the answer is 1. And that's pretty cool. But infinity divided by infinity is obviously 1. It's very simple why that is the case. But if you think about infinity as infinite negative numbers and infinite positive numbers and inclusive of 0 on a number line and all these other numbers that could potentially be that, I don't know, aren't just natural numbers, then infinity divided by infinity makes no sense. It's ill-defined is what Sean Carroll said. It's like, yeah, because you didn't define infinity, and because you couldn't. You can't define infinity in any circumstance other than the circumstance in which I just stated. It is the only circumstance in which infinity is able to be defined, because it's the only circumstance in which infinity is real. Every other instance of infinity that you would call infinity would be ill-defined, meaning wrong. That's why you can't get an answer. It's because you're wrong about the definition of infinity. And I thought that's just fascinating. But it's interesting that 0 is in a natural number, in the number line with negative numbers and positive numbers. 0 is kind of the joiner of them, and it's kind of like, I don't know, like I visualize it as some type of loop, and it's a single loop though. It's like infinite oneness, which is kind of what that shape is. Like my wedding ring represents infinity, endlessness. A ring, a wedding ring represents endlessness, but it also represents unity. And but 0 doesn't exist as an empty set in a metaphysical context. So because of that, infinity minus infinity is probably 1. Infinity divided by infinity is definitely 1.